Welcome to When the Facts Change for this, my first episode of 2026. This show is released every Friday morning on my When the Facts Change Substack. Now, back in the early 1990s, Bill Clinton's chief strategist James Carville coined that famous phrase, "It's the economy, stupid," highlighting what really drives voters, whether or not they feel better off. Well, as the new year gets going, it's the geopolitics stupid that looks set to dominate 2026. Earlier this month, the US conducted military strikes in Venezuela, capturing President Nicolas Maduro, amidst accusations President Trump has breached international law. In Iran, intense anti-government protests mean regime change now look more likely in this pivotal Middle Eastern power than at any time since the Ayatollahs seized control in 1979. And then there's ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. After rising hopes late last year, the chances of an immediate peace agreement now look low. US efforts to broker a deal continue, but rows over territory and security guarantees have stalled progress. Between them, Venezuela, Iran and Russia control around half of all global oil reserves and 40% of natural gas. Energy prices have responded to these geopolitical storms. Crude is up around 10% so far this year, but for now prices are quite benign. I discussed the global New Year financial outlook along with the latest UK growth numbers with When the Facts Change regular Helen Thomas, CEO of the financial consultancy Blonde Money. In other news, without urgent action to stabilise and expand generation capacity, particularly gas-fired generation, the UK faces, quotes, escalating risks of electricity supply shortfalls and widespread system failures well before 2030. That's the conclusion of a new report, Electrification, Can the Grid Cope?, by independent energy consultant Kathryn Porter. Launched in Westminster with plenty of front-bench politicians in attendance, the report is a no-holds-barred assessment of the crisis facing the UK's energy infrastructure. Kathryn Porter joins me to discuss the UK's energy strategy, why net zero targets won't be met and the danger of blackouts. Net zero promises, she says, shouldn't be prioritised over public safety. And here in the When the Facts Change studio, I'm joined by political strategist Malcolm Gooderham, senior partner of Elgin Advisory, someone whose advice is sought by countless firms and investors. Malcolm and I discussed not just geopolitics and the mood in the City of London, but also the domestic political outlook, as Labour tries to postpone local elections across dozens of councils, with Nigel Farage's Reform Party now odds on to win the next general election. This When the Facts Change show is a weekly offering released on Friday mornings for my paying Substack subscribers. Thanks for supporting me, and let's get started. Helen Thomas, great to have you with us on When the Facts Change. Let's just start with the UK economy. These latest growth numbers for the 3 months to November. The economy managed just 0.1% growth. The construction sector fell by 1.1% during those 3 months to November compared to the same period the previous year. When is the UK economy going to get out of second gear?
Well, I don't think anytime soon. I mean, there's a bit of, as I look to the year ahead, I see a positive growth story from the US, and we do always benefit. Of course, you know, we get that rising tide lifts us up. But even with that, I mean, if all of our growth came down to that, I mean, domestically, that's still a pretty terrible story. I mean, look, we've been talking about flatlining, eking out small amounts of growth for really years now. Liam, you've talked about this. I mean, and all we're getting is piecemeal U-turns and constant clobbering of businesses. So, you know, I think the key point now, actually, I talk about growth, and as you say, that's a pretty poor result for those 3 months. Of course, as well, the entire shambles of the budget process weighed on that, clearly, is that there's, you know, the government can say all it likes about give us a chance, turn things around, new ideas, but it's been, what, 18 months now, and business just has to say, well, we've got to work with what's happened so far. We can't work on a hope and a dream. We've got to go on the facts. When the facts change, Liam, as you say with this piece, and they haven't changed. It's a drumbeat of the same story, isn't it?
What is your sense as this new year begins? Obviously, there's a lot of geopolitical turmoil. You're very much a denizen of financial markets, Helen Thomas. What's the sort of mood across financial markets at the moment with all this turbulence in terms of geopolitics?
Well, I'd say it's almost a bit schizophrenic. There's sort of two thoughts are being held at the same time by investors. And like yourself, Liam, at the start of the year, we go to many of these events where we look to that year ahead and see how people are feeling. And there's, on the one hand, quite a bullish sense of a slew of M&A transactions coming down the line, of US tech growing, of even perhaps a peace dividend coming of sorts, in that although there's a lot of volatility, some actual conflicts might calm down and kind of move off the plate. So you've got that bullishness, but then on the other side we started by talking about sort of stagnant growth here in the UK, same sort of story in many European countries, particularly core Europe. While there may be renewed defence spending, that sort of doesn't really set growth alight. And a real serious worry, I think what I see from investors is a worry that the geopolitics, they just can't get a handle on it. They haven't got a framework for it. And if you think about it, for what, I don't know, since the financial crisis, it was all down to what are interest rates going to do? What's the Federal Reserve going to do? Actually, now that isn't the incremental change in the outlook for a price of an asset when you've got the weaponization of economies. So, I sort of, yes, it's a really mixed picture of that sort of initial New Year bullish flows against a longer term higher volatility that people are worried about on the geopolitical side.
That's my sense as well. In the city of London, just down the road from the When the Facts Change studio, there are a lot of people talking about, as you say, mergers and acquisitions, companies combining. That's great for the city slickers, that, lawyers and accountants, they'll get a few quid out of that. But I think the broader picture is, as you say, it's gone away from looking at regular macroeconomic changes, like an obsession about what central banks are going to do when it comes to interest rates. We might get one or two cuts in policy rates here in the UK from the Bank of England, but actual borrowing costs on financial markets could well continue to go up or not come down nearly as much as those policy rates. But a lot of people I talk to now, it is all about the geopolitics, stupid, and a sense that, yes, there's lots of AI hype. The market capitalization of just Nvidia is bigger and has been for some time than the whole of the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, for instance. But on the other hand, that AI, it really depends on data centers. It really depends on electricity supply. There could be problems with that further down the line. And then, in the here and now, straight in front of us, is there going to be some kind of geopolitical spike in risk premiums, with freight costs going up and with, oil prices spiking? I mean, the oil price, Helen, I know you follow that very closely. It's come down a little bit in the 24 hours before we're having this conversation, because there's a sense that Trump is ever so slightly being more emollient or less belligerent when it comes to Iran. But oil prices, Brent crude is $65 a barrel. It's still up, the best part of 10% so far this year. And a lot of that, relatively benign oil price is because of the internal politics of OPEC, with OPEC, overproducing in order to try and smoke out its smaller members that are overproducing on their quotas in order to punish them. Inflation could spring back, energy prices could spike. Do you get a sense, without wanting to be overly dramatic about it, are people talking to you in sort of whispered tones about the possibility of a sort of big lurch coming on financial markets, sparked by not least geopolitics?
Yes, there are a lot of concerns. I mean, it had been on the AI side of things. And of course, classically in markets, if everybody's worried about something, it's not going to be that. It'll be something else. And so it's good you mentioned the oil price there, because I think a creeping fear that's being addressed is energy prices. Because obviously the corollary, as we've just said there on AI, is to power all of that. You need these data centers, and the data centers that are being built, so many, so huge, the so-called hyperscalers, the scale of debt issuance that's coming to finance that. Now, it might be in demand, it might be a very sensible technology, it might be something that's clearly here to stay, but it's just the sheer scale of it. I mean, we're looking at some of this corporate bond issuance could, just for the AI, could eclipse, the entire US corporate bond issuance that has been seen. And what that means is, coming back to something that we often talk about, is all the debt in the world from all the governments, because they racked it all up from COVID. So that hasn't gone away. In many ways, last year was almost a very forgiving year, because, look, the debt issuance was done without a hugely sort of Trussian moment or LDI spike moment that everyone seems to be obsessed by. But that's not the only...
In sovereign bond yields, yeah.
Sovereign bond yields, and that's not the only way that bond markets work, or indeed any market works. We all like to focus on these dramatic moments, but you can also get just a steady rise in what you mentioned there is risk premium, which isn't even just about the level of bond yields. It's to do with how they are, the longer dated bonds compared to shorter dated bonds, the yield curve. They're also country to country relativity and things like that. So you have to look at these spreads as market people like to look at. So I think, coming back to your point on the oil price and where I started on volatility, I think we'll see a year of much sort of lumpier, chunkier moves. So bigger moves in volatility. Now, volatility can be down as well as up. That oil price could dramatically collapse, as you said, something to do maybe with an OPEC decision or a geopolitical event, and then rapidly spike again. And if you're trying to ultimately, if we're looking at the world at large and technological revolution, if it really all comes down to the price of energy, that means there's higher risk just naturally embedded into that. I think what everybody's got on their mind is they can see some volatility coming. They can see, there's not some sort of cure-all these days where governments and central banks are just going to pump out printing money to solve it. They can't do that anymore. And so that's why there's this caution.
Do you really get a sense that the governments can't just, splurge QE all over the place as they have done in previous episodes over the last, since the global financial crisis, basically, of 2008? The markets always seem to be waiting not just for lower interest rates, but also, a massive injection of central bank sponsored liquidity. Do you really think that game is over now, Helen, because there has been so much QE, because there is this kind of lingering inflation? US inflation is up near 3%, as we saw earlier this week.
Here's the thing. Of course, it's like a Pavlovian response. There's still that sense, if something really bad happens, there'll be a huge intervention. It's always happened in the past. It'll happen again. There's some truth in that. But here's the key difference. And actually, why you're doing what you're doing, Liam, and who we're talking to today, which is taxpayers don't want to take it anymore. They've seen what happens when the inflation comes. They've seen how much poorer it makes them feel and completely weighs on their daily lives. And inflation is hugely politically toxic. So what's really interesting, of course, since the start of the year, is the pressure on central bank independence. And it's been brewing, this discussion, for a few years now. And I think it's gathering steam, which is, well, it's all very well to say that, central bank will step in and do things, but if it leads to everyone feeling poorer and a smaller pie, then do we really want these technocrats sitting in a room to be the people making those huge distributional decisions? And actually, so it's interesting now. There was years ago we talked about like the people's QE. I wonder now if actually there would really be a backlash. maybe take a bit of time, but I just don't think it's as easy a political decision. Partly because of the huge amounts of debt, partly because of inflation, and partly taxpayers are getting canny about the game that's been going on.
Of course, in the background of this conversation is the quite incredible open row now lawsuit between effectively Donald Trump and Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve. Trump, of course, appointed Powell back in the day during his first term. Powell was then reappointed by President Biden, and his term is up. I think it's in May this year, and now there seems to be trumped up charges for a renovation project at the Fed going wrong that Trump's trying to lay on Powell as a pretext of disgracing him, if you like, as he leaves office. Quite incredible. I actually think financial markets, there could be serious backlash if there's more QE. I think sovereign bond markets could really erupt if there's more QE, even as debt markets take the sugar rush and even as equity markets, enjoy the sugar rush of QE. I think sovereign debt markets could seriously rebel if we get more QE. Let's just think, Helen, in the last 5 minutes, as we go
Liam,
into...
can I just one thing on that, because you've just triggered it, and it is important people should keep an eye on this. Keep an eye on France, because they've actually got even more of a dysfunctional government than our own. There's a lot going on there, but basically they're struggling to pass a budget, could well collapse again. They could get a new prime minister. I mean, this has been going on for a couple of years in France, but they have a huge pile of debt to GDP. They've got a big deficit. And if we did go down that path of that particular French bond market not taking it, then there's a real problem in the EU, as people remember from years ago, which is it's part of the Eurozone, and then it's problem with the ECB, etc., etc. So just put that on people's radar to keep an eye on France.
I think that's exactly right. I've been reading my columns from 2011, 2012 over the last few days about that then Eurozone crisis. We're in a much worse position now when it comes to the Eurozone, not least because the financial backstop that was Germany is now much, much weaker. German public opinion is even more hostile to doing a kind of big Eurozone bailout as they have in the past. And I agree with you, the chances of turbulence linked to the Eurozone sparked by France, much bigger than Greece, of course, which sparked the 2010, 2011 Eurozone crisis. I do think it's worth putting that on the radar. But just finally, Helen, let's just think about developed markets versus emerging markets. Obviously, a lot of this geopolitical turbulence is staged in emerging markets, if you like. You've got no immediate resolution seemingly coming down the track when it comes to Russia, Ukraine. We know what's going on in Venezuela, or we don't know what's going on in Venezuela, but we certainly know there's been a lot of pyrotechnics with Maduro being put on trial effectively by the US. And then, of course, Iran, Venezuela and Russia between them account for almost half of all global oil reserves. It isn't just about energy, but energy is an important aspect of this. How do you think the emerging markets are going to play out this year? Do you think people are going to be moving assets to emerging markets given difficulties in the West? And if they're doing so, it is at a time of emerging geopolitical risk. How do you think that balance is going to play out?
Well, they're the front line, aren't they? They're the battlefields of this weaponized economies. I mean, we are in a US versus China Cold War, hotting up into a hotter war, becoming an economic war. So that will create opportunities as well as threats. I mean, I saw the port of Singapore last year had record volume of shipping containers, which is interesting because, of course, there's been all those huge trade battles going on. But actually, of course, then things get diverted. Different countries decide. I mean, look, US has clearly put a lot of pressure on Vietnam, where that had been this sort of middleman with Chinese exports. But then we again look at last year, China had a record trade surplus, even with all of this going on, even with the attempt to try and rebalance that that relationship. So I guess what I'm saying here is we're going to have to look very closely at who wants to ally with whom and who is needed for what. I mean, clearly, look, Trump is trying to just redraw the US economic picture. It wants to create a self-sufficient American umbrella where you get defense plus the economic benefits. And obviously China's not going to let that go without a fight. So I just think that emerging markets, you just got to tread carefully with who you think could be the winner in that battle. And actually, it probably means you're going to have to pick a side on, do you think that Trump is doing the right thing and he will be successful, or not? And of course, people have very strong views about this. Who's going to? Of
course, a big theme of last year was Trump's tariffs, shock and awe on April the 1st, even though those tariffs were well signaled by his administration. Markets completely, freak out about those tariffs. Then the S&P 500 ends up, the year much higher than it was compared to when those tariffs were announced. I agree with you on the emerging markets. I think the geopolitics is really going to play heavily, but on the other hand, the emerging markets are still where the growth is, and they've got demography on their side and sluggish GDP numbers in the West. I do think people are going to risk the geopolitical thrills and spills of emerging markets because their economies are just fundamentally stronger and there's less debt. Just final thought from me, Helen, you've talked about the possibility of a Eurozone crisis, and I think that's very apposite as we start the year. I would say that so far this year, so far in 2026, we've seen more and more serious war games by China on Taiwan. We've seen the Chinese government saying to Western governments, if we host recognized Taiwanese politicians, that's going to cross a red line with China. I do think President Xi's New Year address 2026 talked about the inevitability of reunification. His words, given ties of blood, as he said, between China and Taiwan. I think that's going to be the real geopolitical flashpoint of 2026. That's my prediction. China, Taiwan. I think the geopolitical pyrotechnics that we've seen at the start of this year, I think we ain't seen nothing yet.
Now, there's a widening disconnect between the UK's electrification ambitions and the practical realities of delivering them. The power system on which electrification depends is entering a period of acute vulnerability. That's the conclusion of this report, Electrification, Can the Grid Cope?, by independent energy consultant Kathryn Porter, who joins me now on When the Facts Change.
Kathryn Porter, great to have you with us. Your new report, launched this week, is all about, can the UK's electricity grid cope? Can it cope with increased electrification? Can it cope with AI? Can it cope with, the gradual running down of our energy infrastructure over many years? Is there a possibility, can you responsibly say, that we could face power cuts in the UK this year?
Right, so this year, no, not really. I mean, there's obviously always a chance that it would happen, that, you get a conflation of bad things all at the same time, and then you end up with something like that. But I think really the risks are building as we move towards the end of this decade and into the beginning of the 2030s. Now, the reason I think this is because of the way that policy is directing and shaping the grid. We're investing huge amounts of money in wind and solar. And obviously in the period when we have our peak demand in the year, there's no solar contribution at all because it's at night time, dinner time in the evening, it's after sunset. And you can have periods where solar is to be pretty much negligible. we have 32 gigawatts of wind installed on the grid, and the units don't really matter here. This is just to give you an idea of the scale. So 32,000 megawatts, and sometimes we go down to just 200 megawatts. So these are just really tiny proportions. And so
how many megawatts
days,
do we use per day, Kathryn, just to put it in context?
Sorry, say again?
How many megawatts does the British economy use per day?
So in the winter, our normal demand will be about 45 to 48,000 gigawatts. But last week we went over 50. Actually, we went to quite a bit over 50,000. So the difficulty is on those days when you don't have wind and there's no solar contribution because it's nighttime, we rely very heavily on gas. And in its Clean Power 2030 plan, Electricity System Operator has said that we will require all of the 32,000 megawatts of gas generation to be available, maybe only for 5% of the time, but we really need to have all of that for when it's not windy or sunny. Now, there are two difficulties there. One is that these machines don't operate very well on that basis. If you don't run them every 7 to 10 days, they start to break down. Basically, you start to get mechanical problems with them. And the other problem is that our fleet is getting old. A third of those power stations were built in the 1990s and another third were built in the 2000s. And they haven't had the type of upgrades that you would really need to see to extend those lives much beyond where they are now. And if we look at power stations like Peterhead up in Scotland, that was built in 2000. It's had a real degradation in its reliability. And so Scotland actually is in really big trouble potentially. So they only have 2 conventional power stations left. One is Torness, which is a nuclear power station, which will definitely close by early 2032. And then you have Peterhead, which is, end of life. So then you obviously think what we need to do is then upgrade or replace these power stations. And this is where you have the real problem. Because of the demand for powering AI data centers in North America, and because of the fact that gas generation has really fallen out of fashion, there just isn't the capacity in the supply chain to do that. If you want to order a new rotor for your old power station, you might have to wait 5 years to get it. If you want to build a new one altogether, it's 7 to 8 years for a turbine. So we can't just sit here and say, oh, yes, in 2030, the Clean Power plan says we'll have 32 gigawatts of gas running 5% of the time. Some of those power stations will not be here in 2030, and there doesn't appear to be much of a recognition of that. And of course, if we come to 2030 and we have that situation that the gas fleet has eroded on those low wind days, it won't be possible to meet demand. And if you can't meet demand, you have to ration it, otherwise you get a blackout. And that would mean rolling blackouts of the type that we had in the 1970s.
Now, we'll come on to the practicalities of upgrading our gas-fired power fleet. But I think you've done as much as anyone in the public debate, Kathryn, to really highlight what to experts like you is obvious, that when you're using lots of renewables, you need lots of gas-fired power stations on standby to fill those gaps, the so-called intermittency problem. And of course, we have lots of intermittency in this country with our renewables because our sun is unreliable and not particularly strong and so on. But a big aspect of relying on gas-fired power stations to fill those gaps, it isn't just that when you leave these gas-fired power stations not producing lots of energy for a week or so, they can have mechanical problems. It's also very, very expensive, isn't it, to have all this gas-fired powered capacity just waiting in the wings to literally be turned on demand, as it were, to fill the gaps left by intermittent renewables. How big a factor is that, Kathryn, along with other aspects of renewables, subsidies and so on, in ever increasing, it seems, household and corporate bills for energy, which of course has pushed our energy to among the most expensive in the Western world?
Yeah, so it's not an insignificant component of that. All of these power stations, they have costs that they have to cover year in and year out. And some of those costs, it doesn't matter if they're running or not. You've got to still insure them. You've got to make sure that they can operate. You have to carry on with your normal maintenance, all of those things. that just costs money. And already we've seen some power stations leave the market because they weren't making enough money from operating, which is why in about 2016, the government introduced what we call a capacity mechanism, which is a means of paying these power stations money to just sit around ready. So you have that component, but then obviously the subsidies for renewables are going up, particularly for wind. Wind subsidies have now really started to rise quite significantly. Last year, the new auction, the cost of wind was 13% higher than the cost of generating electricity with gas. We're expecting the results of the next auction imminently, and everyone thinks it's going to be even higher again.
I thought this was meant to be cheap energy.
Well,
Ed Miliband keeps telling us renewable energy is cheap energy.
Well, yeah, but it's just simply not true. Right? It's definitely true to say that the wind and the sun are free. If you go outside and you enjoy the sun and want to get a bit of a tan or whatever, nobody's charging you to do that. But the machines that you need to turn that wind and solar energy into electricity are not free. They're pretty expensive, particularly for wind, particularly if you're building it offshore. That should be pretty obvious to most people. If you're going to go build turbines in the middle of the sea, that's going to cost you money because it's a hard thing to do. Then you have to connect them all up. And the thing is, if I want to build a big gas power station, that's going to be about 800 megawatts. Well, 800 megawatts in a wind farm is 60 turbines. So already you've got 60 times more wires. But actually, my gas power station will work 90% of the time. My wind farm will work less than 30% of the time. So I want to get the same electricity over the course of a year from my wind farm that I do from my gas power station. I now need another 3 times what I built. So it's 180 turbines. So, that in itself creates a huge additional cost because all those wires and so on need paying for. And then you have the fact that you get these wind lulls when you've got no wind at all. So you have to pay your gas power stations to be available. You have the issue that you build a load of wind farms in places where you don't have proper infrastructure. Sea Green is a wind farm up off the coast of Scotland. It opened October 23. In 2024, 2/3 of its output had to get turned off, but they get paid for that anyway. It's called curtailment because you couldn't transmit it to where people needed to use it. In 2025, that went up to 75%, 3/4 of the time. It's an enormous waste of money, and we're spending billions of pounds a year on this. And then you have
Is this a bit of a racket, Kathryn, this green energy stuff? There seems to be a lot of trendy corporate types who are making huge amounts of money out of renewable energy.
There has been,
and a lot of them are contributing to the Labour Party.
Well, there's been an awful lot of money made in what we call subsidy farming, that people have recognised that the government has gone absolutely hell for leather to build renewables, that it's actually not in the best interest of consumers. And I think to begin with, they had a notion that costs would fall because it was an immature technology. But we started to subsidise wind in 1990. Yeah, if you're still subsidising something after 30 years, this isn't because it's an immature technology. It's because it's a fundamentally uneconomic technology. And so we've had this lie fed to us that renewables are cheap, and they're just not. Now, if you want to make the argument that you need to do renewables for climate reasons and that might mean paying more for your energy, that's a legitimate argument. It's not necessarily one I personally would make, but it is a legitimate argument. What we cannot have is these continuing lies from the government that renewables are cheap or that they're secure. They're making fools out of everyone. We can see our bills going up, and we can see that it's not always windy and sunny. We know that it's not sunny at night. And so the idea that you can build and power a modern economy of stuff that doesn't work. And actually, in 2025, the availability of wind was less than 30%. And so, these are things that work less than a third of the time. It should be obvious that that is not going to result in cheap energy.
I want to talk to you about the electric vehicle revolution. Of course, the European Union has has pushed back its ban on petrol and diesel cars at least until 2040 from 2035. We're still at 2030. I also want to talk to you about broader policy-making environment, Kathryn, how you as an expert have felt the civil service is operating and not operating in this area. But just briefly before we get on to that, just to go back to your report that you've brought out this week about whether or not our electricity grid can cope. I mean, the head of the national grid, he's been making some pretty dire warnings, hasn't he, about the unsuitability of our electricity grid infrastructure, the fact that it's aging, the fact that it needs an upgrade. What kind of state is the grid in, just briefly, in order to cope with all this extra electrification, not least AI, to which so many of our growth hopes, if you like, are pinned?
Yeah, so quite a lot of our grid infrastructure is pretty old. There was a huge spike of investment in the 1970s. So if you look at what was built before 1980, it's quite significant. And those assets do need to be upgraded and replaced in some cases. Now, we just had, towards the end of last year, Ofgem published the price control for networks, which sets out how much money they are going to be allocated over the next 5 years for various investments that they need to make. And it's very much skewed towards connecting new renewables. And so very much skewed away from maintaining the legacy grid. Now, you look at something like the transmission system operated by National Grid, that they have had their request for what we call non-load capital expenditure. This is the legacy infrastructure, reduced by Ofgem from what they asked for. Now, Ofgem is basing the funding it makes available on the end-of-life assessments that National Grid makes of its assets. But when you think back to that fire they had at Heathrow, the substation by Heathrow Airport in March, now they have this thing called an end-of-life score, and if the score is 0, that means it's brand new, and if it's 100, it means you need to replace it. So Ofgem's giving funding to anything that scores over 75. Now, that transformer at Heathrow that failed was built in the 1960s and had an end-of-life score of something like 12.5. So, I've said to Ofgem, this is very dangerous, because if you take those end-of-life scores from the network companies at face value, and they're giving really low scores to very old assets that blow up, then, this is asking for trouble. So I think we have quite a bit of hidden risk within the transmission system, and quite likely similar in the low voltage distribution systems. The other big issue that we potentially have, and NESO wrote a report on this, it actually came out on the same day as the budget, so it didn't really get much attention, it relates to the offshore gas infrastructure. So obviously we have our North Sea oil and gas production, and a lot of that comes to the shore through pipelines. And also quite a lot of the gas we buy from Norway comes through that same pipeline network. We only have 2 pipes that just go from Norwegian territory to the British coast. Everything else comes through the British pipeline system. And those pipes require a certain volume of a product to go through them to make them possible to operate. And so National Gas and now the National Energy System Operator have identified this risk that because they don't say why, but because it's obviously to do with the fiscal regime, but because we're seeing a faster reduction in production from our North Sea fields, this is reducing the volume of products coming through those pipelines, which could make those pipelines just not viable to operate. Now, we've heard INEOS, which operates the Forties liquids pipeline, say that they're likely to close that system because it's not got enough throughput. Now, if we start seeing that with the gas pipelines, NESO and National Gas are warning that we would then potentially have shortages of gas coming onto the grid on the coldest days. So on normal days, it would probably be fine, but on the coldest days when the demand goes up, they think there just won't be enough gas. Now, National Gas has been saying that risk could start as early as next winter. I think NESO's view is it's a bit later than that. I think it's probably somewhere in between. I'd be surprised if it started next winter, but this is definitely coming. If we don't
within this parliament, within this scheduled
definitely
parliament,
within this parliament, yes. The thing
which is 2029,
again,
of course, is the scheduled end.
You have to deal with these risks before they arise. So your choices are either you reverse the decline of the North Sea, which I think is the most economically sensible option, or you have to put in some other means of getting gas into Britain. And that really is likely to be the sort of floating regasification approach that we've seen Germany adopt to get off Russian gas in the last few years. So it's possible to do that, but you need to have You need to have access to the gas pipes. So we do have spare capacity at a couple of places around the coast. But then you've got to make sure you've got the ship handling capabilities. You've got to build storage tanks and various other things. So it's not an overnight task, basically. And given all our planning rules, then that obviously doesn't help. So again, as with the power generation question, these risks are coming towards us. And if we don't do anything, if we're complacent about them, and this is what worries me. So Des Nesel's approached for comments about my report over the weekend. They haven't seen it yet, but they're telling journalists that I'm scaremongering. Now, how is this scaremongering to point out that we're facing these challenges? That's not
There's a government department accusing you, a very highly regarded independent expert who, you make your living from knowing about this stuff. They're accusing you of scaremongering.
Well, exactly. But the thing is, instead of accusing me of scaremongering, why don't they just say, no, she's wrong. We have a plan. Here's what it is.
Yeah.
Because the fact that these risks exist, it is a fact. Okay, the idea that you would assume that power stations built in the 1990s will still be running in 2030 and beyond, and under adverse operating conditions that they weren't designed to work under, this is a stretch, right? This is not a credible assumption to be making. Their own analysis within NESO says that we have this risk around pipelines. And it should be pretty obvious that grid equipment built before 1980 is also, a potential risk. So all of these things together are risks that we should be cognizant of when we're thinking about energy security. It is not scaremongering to highlight them. I think most of us have home insurance, right? Because we would be concerned if our house were to burn down. I don't buy home insurance because I think my house is going to burn down. I buy home insurance just in case it does, because it would be a really, really big deal. I'd lose the main asset that I own, and it would be, horrendous. So that's why I buy home insurance. It's not because I want my house to burn down or I think it will. It's because if it did happen, it would be really bad consequence.
Quick penultimate question. We just got a few minutes left, Kathryn, if I may. On EVs, we have, of course, seen the European Union push back its target for when it's going to ban the sale of new petrol and diesel cars from 2035 to 2040. The UK, thanks to Ed Miliband, is still at 2030. Is that sustainable? And how much of an international outlier is Ed Miliband when it comes to his absolute cast iron determination to impose his net zero policies, whatever the economic logistical cost?
Well, I mean, he's becoming a byword for irrationality in policymaking. So unfortunately, he's turning us into an international laughingstock. I'm just about to go to North America. I'm flying out tomorrow morning, and I'm going to be traveling all around the US and Canada. And what we hear is just people struggling to really believe what we're doing. They think it's a huge act of economic self-harm. And, to the extent that some people speculate that he's, doing it on purpose because he's in the pockets of the Chinese or the Russians. Now, I think that's probably pushing it too far. And I'm not going to sit here and say that he's a traitor. But people just discuss that. People talk about it. They say, well, we can't come up with any actual rational explanation for this behavior, so we think this is why he's doing it. So I think it's more zealotry than anything else.
Do you think he'll push back our ban on petrol and diesel new car sales
unless
from
he's
2030?
Forced to. And the thing is, so if you look at the data, what's happening? Yes, you're seeing some increase in the proportion of new cars sold that are electric, but overall, fewer new cars are being sold. Far more second-hand cars are changing hands than new cars. And actually, cars are not being scrapped as early as they used to be. And so what we're seeing something of people voting with their feet against buying new cars. Now, part of that is there's still a huge amount of anxiety and just dislike around electric cars. There's a lot of reasons why you wouldn't want to buy an electric car. You might not want to put in the charging infrastructure. You might not be able to charge it at home. And if you can't charge it at home, it's more expensive to have an electric car than to have a conventional one. And even if you can charge it
And
at
that's
home,
before these on-road charges for
yeah,
electric
exactly.
vehicles.
And even if you can charge it at home, after the first year or two, ownership of the electric car does become more expensive because they're more expensive to maintain. The parts cost more, the insurance is higher, and those types of things. And so the cost of electric cars is significant compared with conventional cars. But I think there's also something in there which isn't specific to electric cars around sort of the new safety systems that the EU has imposed on us, driver assist stuff, which actually people don't like and can be quite dangerous. I mean, particularly if you're driving a lot on single track roads, your car suddenly trying to make you swerve because it thinks you're outside of your lane is actually quite hazardous.
Wow.
So I think there's, and also older people in particular, don't like the fact that manufacturers have digitized everything. They like to have knobs to turn. And so I think we are actually seeing some move back away from that with the car makers. And you need to. And I rented a car in North America. I was in Montana. And this thing, I couldn't actually put the lights on and off, because the control, you had to go through about 2 or 3 steps on the menu.
And as you, with your physics degree, you couldn't even turn the lights on the car.
I know, but I couldn't reach it while I was driving. Now, luckily, I wasn't by myself on holiday, so the person I was with was able to just do it for me. But in some states in the US, you have to use your headlights when it's raining, even during daylight. It's the law. So, you know, you're trying to drive your car and you can't actually reach, and you've got to go through a bunch of different menus. Now, if you were doing that to read your emails here, that would be a crime, right? But to go through a bunch of menus on your car to change the heating or the AC or whatever is considered not somehow as bad a risk. I find I can well understand why people don't like them. I don't like them either, because they are a distraction and you just want to press a button. You know, you want the heating on, press a button, twiddle a dial and job done, and it needs to be in reach. So I think that's part of the reason people are being more interested in secondhand, and obviously there's a cost benefit to it as well. So I think there's more to unpack in the sales data on cars than just electric versus conventional. But I think we probably are going to start seeing more of a backlash, and also, you know, it'll be very difficult for the UK to be the outlier in Europe, because our car market, you know, we're not really making many cars ourselves now. It's, you know, most of our cars are imported. So we have to really fit in with what's happening elsewhere.
Very, very briefly, Kathryn, we're way over time, not least because what you're saying is so fact rich and interesting and relevant. But just in a nutshell to finish, you talked about Ed Miliband being very much a kind of net zero zealot. What's been your experience with the civil service? You've been, you've been influencing our national debate, giving evidence to parliamentary committees for quite some time now, if I may say so. You've interacted a lot with ministers and the civil service. To what extent are the civil service driving this net zero at all costs agenda in your experience?
So I think there's quite a big element of that. Talking to sort of former Conservative ministers, they said that when they left office and didn't have access to civil servants anymore and had to start finding information for themselves, they noticed quite a big difference between the information that they used to be given in office and what they were able to find themselves, and identified that what their civil servants had shown them was potentially quite biased. And only sort of one element of the potential information. So I think that's one of the reasons we've seen quite a significant change in direction from the Conservatives. They realised that they were making decisions based on incomplete and biased information. I have had direct experience of having civil servants blocking my access to ministers. They've told me that that the civil service tried to prevent us from meeting, and in some cases succeeded in preventing us from meeting. And, you know, and even where meetings were arranged.
Well, that's when ministers have requested to meet you.
Correct. And the civil servants
it's not you
tried to persuade
knocking on the door of Whitehall, I've got all these graphs and tables. It's ministers requesting to see you based on your reputation and your writing, and the civil service blocking those meetings.
Exactly. And,
That's
in
outrageous.
one case, eventually, the minister stood firm. Yes, I want to meet her anyway. And they tried to prevent it. And then they tried to limit it to just 5 minutes.
Well, this interview's been 25 minutes
Exactly.
and we barely scratched the surface.
And so when we did meet, it was hilarious. We had this room full of people that were not introduced to me because we didn't want to use up the time, and it was like a verbal ping pong. If we'd been at the opposite ends of the table to each other, all the other people would have been going like this, like a tennis match. Because he would say something, I would say something, and there was this really sort of fast paced try and both exchange as much information as possible in the limited time. But and I've obviously discussed this with him subsequently and said, who did these people think they were? By all means, you say, I want to meet such a body, and you say, well, that person might be considered to have some controversial views, and the minister can say, yeah, I understand that, but I want to meet them anyway. That should really be the end of it, right? They shouldn't, beyond that point, keep pushing the issue. And so, I was speaking to somebody. I had a meeting last week in the transport sector, and they said that their view is that there are people within the Department for Transport whose whole sort of purpose in life is just to electrify transport. That they want that to be their career legacy, and then they're not really that interested in the cost.
In a word, Kathryn Porter, in a word, are your views controversial across the energy industry, across the body of expertise in this country and across the world? Are your views controversial?
So no, not anymore, but they were, right? So I think now we're starting to see more people coming round to the idea that our energy policies have not been evidence-based. But if you look back 2 or 3 years, it was very few people wanted to say what I was saying, because even if they thought it, they felt that there would be some backlash against them if they said it. Their shareholders wouldn't like it, their employees wouldn't like it, and so on. Well, I haven't got any shareholders or employees, so I can say what I want.
Their teenage kids wouldn't like it.
Well, yeah, but this is the thing. I mean, and I say this to my colleagues in the oil and gas sector. I know people all think that I get paid by them. I don't. But the point I make to them is that they've really surrendered the narrative to environmentalists. There needs to be a better education of the public about the fact that their lives would just not exist without oil and gas. Oil and gas is intrinsic to not just our lives, but our quality of life. Almost everything in a hospital setting is actually made out of oil. People don't realize, but just about every medication that is available to take is made out of oil. So obviously the machines in the hospitals, tubes, syringes, MRI machines, X-ray machines, the machines that dispense chemotherapy. In fact, the chairs you sit on and the beds and the floors and the walls, the windows, everything is made out of oil, apart from the people and the few bits of legacy paper that they use. Look at technology. You couldn't have modern technology without oil because just about everything is made out of plastic, including like the insulation around the wires and the cables. And then in agriculture, fertilizers made out of natural gas. When Sri Lanka tried to ban synthetic fertilizer a few years ago, they had one of the fastest economic collapses in history. They went from it being a net exporter of rice to not being able to feed their own people and having riots. And so within a few short months, they had to reverse that ban. So when people say we should stop oil, and I actually have a report coming out next month called Can We Just Stop Oil? They're saying that really from a position of great privilege. It's people who've never not had energy security, people who've never not had access to modern healthcare, or not had to wonder about where their next meal is coming from. And if you try to live just one day without touching anything that was made by oil and gas or brought to your possession by oil and gas, you pretty much could only do that if you were willing to sit naked in your garden and fast for the day. Because just about everything we have is either made out of hydrocarbons or relied on hydrocarbons to get to where we are. Even a wind turbine, right, to deliver the components to ship all the steel needed hydrocarbons, they have lubricants in them made out of hydrocarbons. Solar panels, the glass furnaces use natural gas. And a lot of them have like a plastic films on them and so on. So none of this is possible. Our modern life is completely impossible without hydrocarbons. I think we really need to reset our thinking around this and our narratives around it.
Kathryn Porter, great to talk to you as ever. and let's catch up when you're back from the States.
Great, thank you.
So there we have it. That was Kathryn Porter from What Logic. Her new report really is worth a read, and the link to that report will be in my Substack. We also heard before from Helen Thomas, CEO and co-founder of Blonde Money. And now here in the When the Facts Change studio, I'm delighted to welcome Malcolm Gooderham, senior partner at Elgin Advisory. Malcolm, you've been a political strategist over the years, advisor to previous governments. You now talk to lots of investors and business leaders about what's going on. Before we get on to the subjects we covered there with Helen, the geopolitics, and then with Kathryn, net zero, we got to talk about the Conservative Party, a party you know well. As we're recording this episode of When the Facts Change, news that Kemi Badenoch, the Tory leader, has sacked Robert Jenrick. Now, to many people watching When the Facts Change, they won't know much about Kemi Badenoch. They'll know even less about Robert Jenrick. But within British politics, this is quite a big deal. Why?
Well, I think we probably need to put it in context, actually. So I think it's a big deal if you're looking at it through the lens of who's up and who's down today, because obviously the Reform have a great surge this year, and their poll rating is obviously strong. Now we can come back to that because there is some interesting straws in the wind there. So because they have the momentum, the fact that any senior politician joining that party would be seen to be strengthening the momentum of that operation.
This is the guy who Kemi Badenoch beat in the Tory election
indeed
campaign to become Tory leader back in the autumn of 2024.
So only 12 months ago or so. Now, I think the fact that Robert has maintained a high profile means that obviously he's seen as a kind of a coming force, a coming figure. So if you're the Conservative Party, you want to keep your talent, your rising stars. You don't want to lose them. So that's why it's a big deal. But that's only a big deal within the sort of microcosm of the Conservative small c right in this country.
Yeah.
Bigger framework, bigger picture. It's probably not a big deal because the most consequential issue this year for politics and markets from a domestic political sense is probably what happens to Keir Starmer and his Chancellor. That's the only thing that's going to really bother most investors.
Sovereign debt markets and so on.
Yeah, because and more broader than that, because if we have a swing to the left and we have a PM and a Chancellor who are more socialist in their outlook than the current duo, even more socialist in their outlook, then of course what that means for policy, both fiscal probably being loosened and regulations being tightened, could actually affect, as you say, different asset classes in different ways, but it will be adverse. So that's probably the thing that's keeping most people concerned, not the kind of personality politics and machinations on the right at the moment.
I think that's broadly right. Obviously, Westminster is aflame with discussion about Keir Starmer's future. A lot of people don't think he's going to make it through this year, let alone to the next general election. We've got those Scottish Parliament, Welsh Assembly elections, plus local elections in May. Labour are using an obscure clause in the legislation to try and postpone elections in, dozens of local councils across England. Pretty outrageous, really. And indeed, Reform, who are now odds on to be the biggest party in the next parliament, if not with an outright majority yet, but they have headed up, 170 odd opinion polls in a row. They've been leading. I do think it is, in terms of Kemi Badenoch sacking Robert Jenrick. Robert Jenrick has been a very high-profile shadow cabinet minister, but he has been plotting to defect to Reform, and he has been plotting against her. I mean, that's those of us that follow politics very closely and know all the people involved can see that happening. And I think this is quite a bold step by Kemi, a kind of no-nonsense step. I think she's wanted to encourage Robert Jenrick. She's given him a front bench job, even though he challenged her and she beat him in the Tory leadership contest. A lot of leaders wouldn't have done that. but she gave him a very prominent job as Justice Secretary. He's been leading the charge on that, unencumbered by her. But now she's had enough of the plotting and she's really tried to assert some control. And I think it's fair to say now, it's only in the last few months this has happened, there's a lot more speculation, as you say, about Keir Starmer losing the leadership of his party and therefore the premiership than there is about Kemi Badenoch losing the leadership of her party. But we wait and see. So let's get on to the geopolitics, Malcolm. What a start to the year with that triple whammy of Iran, Venezuela, and a seeming lack of any immediate resolution when it comes to Russia, Ukraine. How is this affecting the business community? How is this affecting how corporate leaders are thinking about the global economy this year?
So, well, look, I think the one of the things you do very well in your columns, I know that's what people like about your columns, is you fuse the politics with the economics and also take a sort of international perspective. So that's, and that's great. And I think, as you say, we have had a very sharp start to the year. We've also got to think about Greenland as well in that.
Indeed.
So that's definitely part of that current mix. I think there's an interesting set of distinctions here between what are quotes genuinely geopolitical events and what are kind of regional events and what are kind of local events, and then looking at the impact those events have on different economic factors, right? So if we think about some issues that attracted a lot of attention in the last 2 years or so, and indeed cited by the UK Chancellor as being a reason for increasing her headroom, the conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, the actual story emanating from the Middle East was actually the decoupling of that quote unquote risk, political risk, with the price of oil.
Yeah.
So I think
oil stayed relatively benign despite that political risk.
Right. Yeah. So I think one needs to be quite careful in one's language when thinking about and talking about risk types and what those risk types actually mean. I think sometimes we're in danger of sort of conflating them all, and actually when we sort of look at them more closely, we realise actually the set of implications and the impacts are actually quite diverse. So we shouldn't be too consumed by the amount of headlines, the volume of coverage. That doesn't necessarily dictate the actual driver in terms of economic instability and indeed political instability in other regions. I mean, so the three that are out there that are currently live, I mean, obviously the one that trumps all of those will be what China does with Taiwan, as you say. Now, obviously, there's a lot of focus on the significance of 2027 because it's several reasons. Obviously, you've got the Xi term. You've also got the centenary of the Red Army. And some of these things are important factors in the way they're approaching it.
And Xi has told his head of military to be ready to overwhelm Taiwan by 2027. He said that explicitly.
Yeah, that's, yes, readiness for it. Now, I suppose what we've got to do then is then stand back and say, okay, so what does that look like and what does it mean? And obviously most firms and actually most governments have actually sort of war gamed the implications of this. So there shouldn't be a lack of preparedness for this. So the shock factor should actually be quite low. So the question then becomes actually, so how do they go about reunification? The sort of China watchers that we pay most attention to are ones that actually either from the region or know the region very well, not people pontificating in ivory towers in London and Washington. And they're basically looking at it in several phases. You've got the kind of intimidation phase, which is all the grey zone tactics we've got. Then you've got the kind of isolationist.
China using AI images, bots to flood Taiwanese social media. China messing with undersea cables, it now seems, and lots of flyovers, Taiwanese airspace. They've all escalated in the last 6 to 12 months. In the last 6 to 12 days.
Yeah, no, all of that. So, well, you can go back further. I mean, you saw what happened when you had the Pelosi visit in response to that. Yeah. Now, I mean, so they've obviously tried to get Western politicians to stay away, not to recognise Taiwan and all that sort of stuff. So you've got a kind of, the kind of intimidation phase. They're probably going to move to kind of an isolation phase where they want to try and really sort of cut off the island, both sort of politically and then also economically. And that's where obviously the friction starts to come because of the trading routes. And
they're very dependent on, as you know, as we've discussed, imported liquefied natural gas in Taiwan.
And we know the importance of semiconductors and what that means. So you've got the sort of isolation there of the economy, which would have profound impacts, and then obviously you've got integration. So the question I suppose we're looking at is, what's the ultimate tactics play here? Do they go to that fourth eye, as it were, i.e. invasion, or do they sort of stick with a sort of integration and isolation and go down more the Hong Kong model?
Yeah.
Now the challenge then becomes for Western governments in particular, and one also means Five Eyes, Australia, New Zealand, etc. How do they kind of respond to that? We'd probably see a playbook not dissimilar to Russia.
Yeah.
So we'd see a sort of financial response before a military response, which kind of then means obviously huge disruption would flow. Big question mark, what does the Trump administration do? And he's obviously trying to keep that open. It's a deliberate strategy. They used to call it strategic ambiguity.
Yeah.
He's obviously doubled down on that. So let's that would be one of the biggest obviously movers on that. We don't know how he would respond, but we are sort of looking now more closely, I think, at this this sort of dominance in the Western Hemisphere that he's played, and then what's the sort of what does that mean for outside the Western Hemisphere, and what does that mean in terms of transactional relationships, and how does he manage that? That's obviously huge. So I think, sorry, long answer, but you've got those three issues to start with. You've obviously got that's a huge issue, and the amount of attention that actually attracts at the moment is very low compared to, say, the situation in the Middle East. So
that's why I'm glad we focused on it. I do think it's pretty amazing, given the start to the geopolitical year, if you like, given how it's dominating the airwaves, here in the UK. It's pretty amazing that the three big geopolitical stories that are running at the moment may not be the biggest geopolitical story of the year, any of the three of them. It could be Greenland, it could be China, Taiwan. So I'm very glad that we've emphasised in particular the latter of those. Just finally, Malcolm, let's talk about net zero. This report by Kathryn Porter is very influential, I think. It was launched in the House of Commons. I was there. Lots and lots of front benchers were there. Lots of senior politicians were there. Kathryn Porter is extremely well connected. She's really come to the fore over the last couple of years as an independent energy consultant with a lot of smarts on the technical side, but somebody who can also write and project and create a buzz with her newspaper columns and so on. It strikes me that the Overton window on this debate really is shifting very, very rapidly. I think Kemi Badenoch had something to do that. She did a speech on net zero last spring, where her first big policy intervention, saying the Tories don't think net zero 2050 is possible. We're going to water down our commitments. That, I think, has led to people on the left of the Labour Party linked to heavy industry in the UK saying that all this stuff is destroying our economy. Where is corporate Britain on this now? A lot of the boardroom leaders that you advised, they would have been very interested in their green credentials and so on. Is that still a thing in corporate Britain, or is corporate Britain retreating too?
So I suppose it depends what parts of corporate Britain we're talking about, really. So obviously, if you've got the energy industry per se, and you saw what happened with BP this week, and they're right down and what that meant. Yeah, that's quite strong.
BP really shifting back to their core oil and gas, away from renewables, which they've been emphasising for much of the last decade. Yeah,
I think actually the timing of the write down probably was more the issue rather than the fact they were going to do it. And I think so. Obviously, you've got the energy industry. Is trying. It's very difficult for them actually, because they're trying to read the political situation, understand, what's the sort of certainty they've got in terms of the policy framework, and it's probably not as much certainty as they would like. They obviously can see the polls, and the polls point to a change of government in the UK, in 2 years' time, and sort of more broadly, they can see what the polls are pointing to in some of the major economies in Europe as well. So, for their point of view, it's not a good environment perhaps for investing. And then I think, I think the flip side of that obviously is, where's consumer support for this? And, I think that's it's now about cost of living for them. And I think that issue is going to remain salient. So that's going to keep the political pressure on the energy industry to sort of reduce costs and, reduce the amount of subsidies they've got. And then I think within that, you've got, the institutional investor. It becomes very difficult for them to perhaps invest as well because they're nervous about the political framework. So it's probably it's not the level of certainty any of them want. And that's the problem. We've got to wait now 2.5 years for a general election in this country, unless we have some sort of freak event, which we probably shouldn't rule out. So, when are we going to get that certainty? And I think, we need to have the general election in this country. Then we need to then get the government that can then plan. And they obviously, we know now the size of the majority isn't the important thing.
No.
So the question is, let's see the strength and the quality of the leadership. So without that sort of change in this country, I don't think both the energy industry and the institutional investor is going to perhaps get exactly what they want.
Final question. You're a very schooled student of politics, Malcolm. We know within the Labour Party there are trade unionists who really don't like net zero. Britain's energy complex, heavy industry and so on. A lot of those firms are really suffering from very, very high energy prices, which they link to the increasing use of renewables. Could we possibly see a significant U-turn from the Labour Party on net zero? We've just seen Kemi Badenoch sack Robert Jenrick. Could we see Keir Starmer sack Ed Miliband, his energy secretary, who really is, the most zealous government minister when it comes to net zero? Or would that be impossible for Starmer, given how popular Miliband is among Labour activists?
Okay, I think it's probably three things there. Starmer's one of the weakest PMs we've ever had. He won't sack his best friend, Ed Miliband. This won't happen, right? Two, I don't think we're going to see Labour do anything that is sort of too dynamic or bold, because they just don't have the sort of clarity of vision and strength of conviction anymore. So they're more likely to vacillate on stuff. And we may get U-turns because they're so weak, they're going to be governed by the polls. The polls show them it's not a popular issue. So what do weak politicians do in that situation? They typically cave. So we're already over 12 U-turns from this government in 18 months. I think we should probably anticipate some dilution of that agenda. Now, if Ed Miliband can stay in the cabinet and have his agenda diluted, I think he's there. One shouldn't rule out, in a kind of change of Labour leadership, Ed Miliband's position actually being solidified, possibly even becoming a chancellor. Now,
Crikey.
Course, yeah,
way to the left of Rachel Reeves.
But it gets worse.
Even more statist.
It gets worse, though, doesn't it? Because if they end up going with Andy Burnham, if he gets back into the House,
the Manchester mayor,
so-called King of the North, now that is even a more shocking outcome, because he's now talking about a business-friendly socialism, which for most people is an oxymoron. So if you had
Andy Burnham, who said, "Why are we always in hock to the bond markets?"
Right. So a Burnham in number 10 with a more left-wing chancellor than Rachel Reeves.
That's
I mean, it's
all bets will be off.
All bets will be off, and some people are talking about the financial markets bringing the country to a point where we have to have an early election. The question is, would Labour MPs ever vote for an early election? And it's difficult to see that. But it's also difficult for them to see them keeping Keir Starmer in his post. Because to keep Keir Starmer in post means you're basically sacking yourself. So Starmer's days look numbered, and I think the whole net zero agenda, their days look numbered, because there's a lack of political will to actually drive that through, and actually perhaps some of the case that they've made before rests on such a strong upside. That anyone who's got a more sort of balanced or realistic perspective,
like Kathryn Porter, for instance,
then I think you start to see some of the enthusiasm for that come out. So I think that's probably where we are. But look, very good to be here in your studio. very much enjoyed being here. It's fantastic, and well done with everything you're doing. And I'm sure it's going to go from strength to strength.
Thank you, Malcolm. Great to have you with us here on When the Facts Change. So that is Malcolm Gooderham. He is Senior Partner at Elgin Advisory, someone very well steeped in the whys and wherefores, not just of Westminster, but also the City of London. Thanks so much for joining me here on When the Facts Change. This show is available early to paid subscribers on my Substack. Please join me for the next episode of When the Facts Change. It comes out every Friday morning. Thanks for being with me.
Thanks for joining When the Facts Change, economics and politics in a fast-moving world with me, Liam Halligan. Please subscribe to my When the Facts Change YouTube channel and my podcast via Spotify, the podcast app, or wherever you listen. And above all, please subscribe to my When the Facts Change Substack for more of my interviews and writing.